Hi everyone, welcome to this series of Excel tutorials that I put together. These tutorials are intended for students in COM 421, but really they can benefit anybody who's looking for a set of tutorials to take them through the basic operations of Excel. I don't assume that anybody knows anything going into these tutorials about Excel, unlike a lot of the tutorials on the web. So we're going to run through some of the basic functions, and then we'll get to some of the more difficult calculations that Excel makes possible. Let's first talk about what Excel is useful for. Excel puts data into spreadsheets, and spreadsheets are just labeled rows and columns. Rows are labeled with numbers, columns are labeled with letters. It's also useful for making data visualizations such as charts, graphs, etc. But the real power of Excel is performing calculations. It's like a calculator that you can program yourself to do complex calculations. Excel is for doing the calculations. Word or other word processing software is for presenting the data to people once it's in a more refined format. In Word, data is organized into tables. You can paste visualizations that you make in Excel and add captions. We'll cover that in a later tutorial. And also report the data so that it's in an organized and clean format. Excel is for performing calculations. You would never send someone an Excel file and use that as a final presentation medium for presenting data, and we'll cover more in later tutorials about why that's the case. In this first lesson, we're going to learn how to enter data into Excel. We're also going to learn how to make very simple formulas that calculate the central tendency of data. And that's the mean, median, and mode, the three different types of central tendency measurements. So here I am in my email account, and I've got an email from myself, but we'll pretend that this is somebody I have to listen to. And I've got volunteer hours recorded for 4 different employees for 3 months. So imagine that somebody asks you to track these volunteer hours. You can look at the bottom here. We've got a request. Tell me the average number of hours per employee and per month, as well as the average and median number of hours for all employees over the same period. If we were to try to calculate this by hand, it would take you probably about 20 or 30 minutes, but in Excel we can do it much faster. For the first few tutorials in this series, we're going to use Google Spreadsheets, which is a free version of Excel made by Google. It doesn't have all the functionality of Excel, but it has enough to get started, and that way if you don't have Excel on the computer you're using, you don't have to worry about getting it for these first couple tutorials, because the functions are essentially the same between the two applications. So why don't we get started? You can see up here we've got the Google Apps button. I'm using Google Apps for Education. If you're using Gmail, you'll have the same apps button up here. I'll go ahead and click on that, and then I'm going to click on Drive. If you're opening Drive for the first time, you're going to get a welcome message from Google that explains some of the features, etc. But I dispense with that already. So we want a new spreadsheet. So we'll go to New, and then Google Sheets. There'll probably be some sort of introductory message here too. Perhaps not. So, first thing I'll do is title this spreadsheet. I'll just call it volunteer hours. So next I want to start entering data. If I go back to the email, you can see I have a list of months, employees, and hours. I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste all of this into the spreadsheet so that it's easier to work with, so I don't have to keep switching between windows. You can right click on that and do copy, or Control C, Command C. So I'll just paste this over here to the side where it's not going to be intrusive. So there's my list. There's no real rules, as far as I know, about where to put names or category values versus chronological values, but I prefer to do categorical values as rows and chronological values as columns. So that's what I'm going to do here. So I'll start by putting in the months. And then I'll put in the names. To move around easier in Excel or Google Spreadsheets, which is what we're using right now, you can use the arrow keys instead of clicking on each individual cell. It saves you a little bit of time. Here you can see that we've got values for each of the employees. However, you'll notice for some months that there's no value for a particular employee. So I'm going to go ahead and put all of these values in, and if you want, you can pause the tutorial here and pick it up once you've entered all of the values if you're following along. Okay, you can see I have all of the values entered from my volunteer hours data. So why don't we first calculate the totals for each employee and also for each month. There's a couple ways to do this, but I'm going to show you first how to structure a formula in Excel and in Google Spreadsheets so that you can learn the basics of how to put together any formula. All formulas start with the equal sign, so type that in the empty cell. First, let's find the sum. So I just start typing the name of the formula I want. Sum just calculates the sum. It totals all of the values in the range that you specify. If you want to autocomplete the name of the formula, you can either click on it here or just hit Tab. So now you need to provide a range. A range is just a notation that indicates where the values you want to perform that operation on lie. So I can do this one of two ways. I can use my mouse and click on the start of the range of values I want, and then hold the mouse button down and drag the cursor until I've selected all of the values. Or, I can use my arrow keys on the keyboard and move over to the first cell in the range. Then I can hold the Shift key down and use the arrow keys to extend the range. So I'm hitting the right arrow key. I'll put in a close parenthesis, and the formula is complete. All I have to do is hit enter. And there's the sum. We can do the same thing for average. Equal sign, and I'll start typing in average. Use the tab key to autocomplete. Then I'll use my arrow keys to go over to the data range. Close parenthesis, and enter. Now you can see I get a value here with a lot of decimal places. If I want to round that off, I can just go to Format, Number, and you can see there's any number of different ways to format the data. I'm just going to select number, which will truncate all of those decimal places to 2. I'll go ahead and title these. Now I could type in these formulas for each of the remaining employees, but there's a much simpler way to do this in Excel. If you see here, there's a box in the bottom right-hand corner of this cell. I want to just hover my cursor over there until I get this crosshair, and then I'll click on it with the mouse and drag it down, and that will auto-complete the formula that I have in this cell down to these 3 cells, and it'll use the corresponding data ranges in each row to calculate the total. And I'll do the same thing for average. Just hover over that box until I get the crosshair, drag it down. Let's do the same thing for the columns for each month. I'll start by entering my formula. Then I'll select the range. And I'll do the same thing for average. Oops, there we go. Make sure when you're doing this you don't accidentally include this value, right? That will throw your results off. And I can do the same thing. Just drag it over. And I'll put in some labels. If we want to distinguish the calculations from the data points, one thing we might do is put a border around these cells here, or for now, why don't we just highlight this whole range and make them italics. And I'll do the same here. Remember, Shift and the arrow keys to highlight a range. We're totally done now with this original data, so we can get rid of it. I'm just going to highlight the range and hit delete or backspace. Now, the original email called for some additional central tendency numbers, so why don't we find the average amongst all employees over the 3-month period, and then also the median, which will show us the point in the data where 50% of the data points are below and 50% of the data points are above. So first I'll type in some labels here. Let's first calculate the average, and we'll do it the exact same way. And now let's calculate the median. Again, the equal sign, and then I'll start typing my formula name. Formula names, once you get to more advanced functions, are somewhat idiosyncratic, but with enough use, you'll start to memorize what they are. Once we start doing these tutorials in Excel, I'll show you how to search for formulas that might be of use to you. I'm going to go ahead and format this number so that it only has 2 decimal points. Now you can see the average is higher than the median value. The average is skewed upwards because we have a data outlier here. Mark, in the month of August, worked 35.5 hours, or volunteered 35.5 hours, and that's much higher than any of the other values in the data set. What the average is essentially the arithmetic mean. So it takes the total of all of the values in the data set and divides them by the total number of values, which in this case would be 12. And that's how you get this number. The median calculates the point in the data where 50% of the values are below and 50% of the values are above. So sometimes the median is more accurate as a measure of central tendency simply because you have an outlier or a value that's much higher or much lower than the other values in the data set. So next I'm going to show you how to take this data and send it off. Alright, it's time to send this data out. Everything you've done, by the way, is saved in the cloud here on your Drive account. There, you can see the file that we were working on right now. You also get this little note from Google telling you everything is saved. But you'll want to send these as attachments from time to time. So let's download it and send it as an attachment. I'm going to click on File here, then Download As. Microsoft Excel, that's the format that most people can open and view. I'll save this on my desktop. If you're using Windows, this will look slightly different. Let me move over to the desktop here. There's the file I want to send. So I'll go back to the email. Now you may notice from the beginning of this tutorial that I'm already breaking one of my rules, which is that you don't just send Excel files as the final report to somebody who's asking for the data. But in this case, we're just going to do that, and we'll worry about putting it into report format in one of the later tutorials. So I'll reply to myself or whoever's asking for the data. Remember a salutation in your email. And a closing. It's not polite to send without either. I'll go ahead and click on the paperclip here to attach it. There's the desktop. There's my file. Data sent. In later tutorials, we'll move on to some of the more advanced functions that Excel allows you to do. But for the next tutorial, we'll keep working in Google Spreadsheets because it's essentially the same until you get to some of the more complex calculations and functions that Excel offers. So that's the end of tutorial 1.